Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Mondays with Michelle video. This week's topic, suffragettes. We'll look at a wide range of websites that offer records and background information about the women's suffrage movement and the suffragettes. We'll also look at a worldwide timeline indicating when women in different countries were granted the right to vote. Let's get started. The National Archives does have a really good collection of suffrage records. So this page, if you scroll down, it shows their research guide, which we'll look at in a moment. They've got a blog section that has information on women's suffrage. They also have a lot of teacher resources, these classroom resources, and we'll look at a few with information. And there are some videos. Here's one that's Suffrage Tales. So there are quite a few items on here that would be of interest. So let's look first at this research guide. And if we look at the research guide, it gives an overview of the collection, the period of time. There are some items that you can view online through partner websites like Find My Past, and I'll show you those shortly. Ancestry also has one list of suffragette names. There's also cabinet papers that you can access. What I found interesting and something I hadn't really considered, when you're searching through census records, in the keyword field on Ancestry, if you put in the word suffrage or suffragette, it will pull up the census records for some of the suffragettes that wrote comments on the form. A number of them basically decided if they didn't have the right to vote, they were going to opt out of the census. So they wrote their opinion and comments on the census form. So that's kind of interesting to look at. There's also the arrest records for the suffragettes. So there's quite a few different types of records that you can find. There's also obviously things in the newspaper. So there's a lot of information here, as well as some of the government codes to look through the government records for information, and a list of organizations that you can also search on to find more information. So that's a useful research guide. The National Archives also has, as I mentioned, some classroom resources. And just to give you an idea of what that involves, this is one called Suffragettes on File. So they have curated a number of documents that can be used in the lesson plans. So you've got suffragist petitions, you've got images, you've got information on the imprisonments, information on the newspapers that they had, information on some of their campaigns, the window smashing campaign, and how these suffragettes were forcibly fed. So these classroom resources, I think, can offer a lot of information that's useful. There's also, again, another classroom resource called Outrage at Q. So these are reports on some of the suffragists This resource entitled Cats and Mice refers to an act passed in 1913 called the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge Health Act. The imprisoned suffragettes would go on hunger strikes, and the government wanted to prevent any of these women from dying in prison. This new act allowed the government to release the women who were at risk of dying and have them recover at home. Once they recovered, the women were rearrested and returned to prison. The suffragettes referred to this new act as the Cat and Mouse Act. They said it was kind of like a cat playing with the captive mouse, letting it go and then catching it again. And that was very much the way the government was treating the women, releasing them so that they could recuperate at home and then putting them back in prison again. So that was an interesting resource. The National Archives also has a lot of podcast episodes and videos that shed some light on the suffragette movement and the main players in the suffrage movement in England. So there's a lot of good resources there. There's also a number of other websites I came across that might be of interest. This is a website that has background information on the suffragette movement, information on particular suffragists, information on the Pankhursts, some of their militant tactics. So there's, again, a lot of good background information. And historic England, again, if you look at the table of contents on the left, there's some good resources here. They talk about HMP Holloway, the prison. There's information on campaigning, the types of protests they did. And one of my favorite websites was the Museum of London website. They had an exhibition on suffrage in 2018, 2019, and a lot of this information is still available on the website in their virtual collection. So you can scroll down and find out about some of these women who were suffragettes. You can find out their story. They also have some background. It says that they have one of the world's best and biggest collections of material on the Votes for Women campaign. And some of the items they have, this is one they talk about some of the objects, the toilet paper diaries. The suffragettes that were imprisoned used to write notes or keep diaries on toilet paper or little bits of cards. And that's what they talk about here. So that's quite interesting. Now, the British Newspaper Archive, it is a subscription website, but for those who are interested, the blog itself is something you can access for free. And I found it interesting. They have a list of the suffragette newspapers that you can access and the years of coverage. There's quite a few of them. So those can be accessed on British Newspaper Archives website or on Find My Past with a subscription. And if you go to Find My Past and type in suffrage when you do a record search of the catalog, a search of their collection, you will notice they've got a few resources. They've got a New Zealand resource. They've got women's suffrage petition. This is their main collection, the Suffragette collection, and they also have the Suffragette newspaper collection that you can browse. And I'm not logged on right now, but I did click on that Suffragette collection browse. And even if you don't have an account, you can still see the details of what the records are all about. So the kind of information they have is arrest reports, personal statements about the arrests, cabinet letters, reports of mistreatment and force feeding, as well as transcript of speeches. So there's some interesting documents there that would be helpful if you have suffragette ancestors in your family tree. And although Ancestry doesn't have as much as Find My Past, they do have this list of suffragettes that were arrested. And this list came about when the suffragettes apparently decided to cease their militant activities when war was declared. The government made a list of all of the suffragettes that were imprisoned at that time. And so they went through all their records, and that's where this list came from. So you may find that you have ancestors listed in this particular resource. So that might be of interest. And I thought we might as well take a look at some websites that had information on the suffrage movement in other places. So the National Records of Scotland website does have background information on women's suffrage in Scotland. So there are some useful links here if you want to know more about how the suffrage movement played out in Scotland. Similarly, I found there are a lot of newspaper articles that talk about the history of the suffrage movement in Ireland. So there's some useful resources here. And I found this New Zealand website. What I thought was really interesting, it gives a world timeline of the suffrage movement. And what fascinated me was the dates when different countries or states gave voting rights to women. So if you take a look, there were some of the areas in the US gave rights to women at a very early date. For instance, we've got 1869, Wyoming Territory. I thought this was interesting. Utah gave the rights in 1870 and then abolished it in 1887, restoring it in 1896. New Zealand has the distinction of being one of the first countries to give the right to vote to women in 1893. Australia, South Australia, they gave some rights in 1894. So I found it quite fascinating that there were other countries who had given voting rights or substantial rights to women well before the English suffrage movement was successful. And I also found it interesting that looking at Canadian records, so here's British Columbia, and Canada gave some rights, but only to those in the armed forces. It wasn't until 2 years later or 1 year later that Canada extended the right to vote to those of British or French extraction. So I found that timeline was interesting just to see how the suffrage movement played out. And I've got some links here for background information on the suffrage movement in Canada for those of you that are interested in the Canadian arm of things. Family Search does have a lot of resources in their books when you search on suffrage. A large percentage of them are going to be focused on the US suffrage movement. And this website gives good background information, the history.com website, on the US suffrage movement. It's a good starting point. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. Don't forget to download the handout. You'll find the link in the video description at the bottom of your screen. You may need to click Show More to see the handout links. Thanks for watching.